Hello everyone and welcome back to the Fireside Chats with Father Zarse. We now enter into Palm Sunday, and with Palm Sunday comes the beginning of the holiest week of the year. We will celebrate the sacred Triduum this week with Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday. And caught up in these 3 days, the holiest days of the year, the institution of the priesthood, the institution of the Mass, with the Blessed Sacrament. And with this Good Friday comes the passion and death of Jesus Christ before the glory of his resurrection, conquering sin and death. That's what we have to look forward to in the coming days this week. But for today, on Palm Sunday, I want to focus in a particular way on the next deadly sin in our list, which is greed. We've taken the time to look at pride, anger, envy, lust, greed is the next one on our list. So with greed, I think a great example of greed is what happens at the beginning of our gospel today. So we have Judas Iscariot, who has presented himself before the leading authorities in Jerusalem. And he actually makes the decision to betray his best friend, Jesus Christ, for 30 pieces of silver. Now, at first glance, this seems like the most terrible decision, just the most egregious crime that it strikes us as wrong. How could you betray Jesus, your best friend, for money, for 30 pieces of silver? But I think if you take a step back and you consider what our tradition has to say about the deadly sin of greed, it becomes a little more uncomfortable. So greed is a kind of fascination with material goods. It's a kind of rejection or denial of supernatural goods, my relationship with God, my relationship with other people, the love of God, the love of neighbor. I ignore these because I'm focused on obtaining more wealth, more property, more real estate, and it's insatiable. It's never enough. So it's very strange, but it's usually the case that the more money that I acquire, the more property that I acquire, the more that I worry about it. And that's, I think, one of the litmus tests. If you find yourself really thinking a lot about what you possess, or maybe rather what you don't possess, if you find yourself wrestling with envy, because these are deadly sins that are like sisters, you have on the one hand envy, and on the other hand greed. And these flow together into anger, because I wish that I had more than I currently possess, and I'm frustrated that somebody else does. If you find yourself wrestling with this, just be honest and bring this to the Lord. So what we have here, I think, in the gospel is a scene. We have Judas Iscariot, who is willing to give up Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Before you pounce on him for that decision, consider the fact that here in the United States, we have roughly 5% of the world's total population. And yet, despite only coming up or comprising 5% of the world's total population, we are consuming 25% of the world's natural gases, its coal, and also its oil. I think that's a great example of greed here in the United States. I love the United States, but I think that we need to be honest, we are very greedy. So we need to be patient with Judas, and we need to consider what can I learn from this, rather than simply criticizing his decision and dismissing it as though there's not something here for me to consider. How can I grow from his example? So we know that Judas Iscariot, we know that he was the accountant. We know that he was the financier for the apostles. He carried the purse. We also know in the Old Testament in Scripture, it says in some parts of the Jewish wisdom literature that the love of money is the cause of all evil. That this kind of covetousness, it goes back to the death of Abel with his brother Cain. It's a kind of fascination with simply acquiring more property and more possessions. We need to be careful. So the corresponding virtue that counteracts some of this greed is generosity. And so it's insofar as I'm willing to make a gift of myself. Maybe it's my time, maybe it's my talent, maybe it's some of my treasure. When I choose to give this away to the Lord and to my neighbor, it's a funny thing. There seems to be this kind of joy, this kind of meaning, this kind of purpose that flows out of my generosity. Whereas when it comes to greed, no matter how much I may seem to acquire and bring unto myself, It doesn't add to joy. It doesn't seem to bring happiness or meaning or beauty, because even some of the most powerful, wealthy people that live on earth, sometimes it robs them of their joy. And they'll be the first to tell you this. Everybody's coming to them looking for something, and they just worry about losing what they have. So I think that's part of the logic and the wisdom of prudence, of course, but in generosity. So the only other thing I wish to do today, because we have plenty of time in the days to come to look at Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday, is to consider some of the characters in today's gospel from Matthew. So we have on the one hand the apostles, on the other hand the crowds, and finally some of these judges, like Herod and Caiaphas, and we have Pontius Pilate. Notice how fickle the human heart is. On the very night of their ordination, the apostles break out into an argument over who is the greatest among them. Then you have the crowds. On a Sunday, on Palm Sunday, they welcome Jesus as a great prophet. And by Friday of the same week, they are literally crying out for his blood. Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Notice the fickleness of the human heart. And finally, we have with some of these judges. Take, for example, Herod, who is the puppet king of the Romans, and we have the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate. Both of these judges find Jesus innocent on 3 occasions. On 3 occasions, they declare him innocent, but because of the fickleness of their heart, they condemn him because of the pressure coming from the crowds and the pressure coming from the Jewish authorities. So I think that we just want to take the time on this Palm Sunday to consider what we can learn from these characters, what we can learn about the fickleness of the human heart, and what we can learn about greed, the deadly sin of greed, which seems to have turned Judas on his head. We want to be careful as Americans, living in the wealthiest nation on earth with the most amount of resources, to be careful not to put any of these other material possessions before our relationship with Jesus. Because if we do, we're just as guilty as Judas. So this is Father Zarse signing off on Palm Sunday. From my heart to yours, from my home to yours, I wish you the very best during this season of lockdown. I will be back in just a few days' time for the Sacred Triduum with Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday.